as a provider. I don't want to just know him as a provider. I want him to know him as a righteous keeper. I don't want to just know him as a righteous keeper. I want to know him as a battle axe. I don't want to just know him as a battle axe. I want to know him as the lamb. But I don't want to just know him as the lamb. I want to know him as the lion too. Because there's multiple dimensions to who he is. And that's what David is saying. He says, I'm after God so much that I want to put a demand on him. I want to put a demand on knowing him. In fact, he says, I require it. I require of myself to know him. But notice what he also teaches us. He teaches us by this concept of seeking, that the avenue of my seeking, the right vehicle that I'm supposed to use in my seeking, is prayer and worship. When you look up this term seek in the Hebrew, it means to seek deity through prayer and worship, which means through my prayer, through my consecration, and through worship, it becomes my vehicle that gives me access into the environment where he is. So when I spend time in prayer and worship, it gives me access to God's presence. Worship and prayer leads me into his presence. When I spend time on my face, I gain access into his glory. Now, the brothers and sisters, this is what I want you to see, and I promise you, I got to let this go. This has been what I've given you is verses 1 through 6. All right, I've given you verses 1 through 6. Verse 6 teaches us that we must be a part of the generation of those that seek him. But he then gives us directives on how to do it, and we get directives in verse 7. Now, some of you may be curious, like I was, as to what this means in verse 7. Because when we come to verse 7, we have quoted this verse as well as the following verses, 7 through 10. We've quoted it a lot of times in our churches. We've quoted a lot of times in our spiritual walk. We've quoted them, and knowing the beauty of the words, we've experienced the power of the words. But I didn't know, Derek, why these words were so beautiful and powerful until the Lord took me to them in my study and unpacked something for me that I had never seen before. Now, to give you this history behind the text, or these words, when David speaks of lift up your heads, O ye gates, and be ye lifted up, ye everlasting doors, and the King of glory shall come in. Yes, in the history or the historical context of this psalm, David is actually referring to the re-entrance of the ark back into the tabernacle for which he was responsible. Why? Because David understood, as king, it doesn't matter what authority I possess, I cannot make the same mistake as Saul. I cannot function in my role as a king if I don't have the glory of he who is the King of Kings. So I got to get the glory back before I move in my ministry. I can't go in my anointing. I can't go forward in my anointing without his glory. I can't do greater works if I don't have his presence. So David said, I got to get the ark. And as he saw the ark coming, lift up the gates, open the gates, open the everlasting doors. And the reason why he even uses everlasting doors is because he is actually speaking not just to the re-entrance of God's presence in this moment, but he's also speaking of the future of the New Jerusalem, which will be rebuilt after the tribulation period, when God reestablishes Jerusalem again. And he is saying that this concept of doors is actually everlasting. So open the everlasting doors of Israel, because God's going to always cause his people to prosper. That's what he's actually getting at. But when I looked at that context, God showed me something else that it kind of struck me. And I said, I ain't never seen it this way before. Because when the Lord helped me me to see is that not only is he referring to the return of the ark, but David is prophetically speaking of what happens when our posture as God's creation takes in the digesting and the consumption of his glory. Hold on here. He is saying literally take on a posture that allows you to consume or digest the glory. How do you do it? You are to open the gates. What does gates in this text actually refer to metaphorically? It speaks of the sensual perception of a person. Here it is. When I connect to my world, I connect through my senses, my sight, my hearing, my smell, my taste, my touch. That is my natural means of perceiving my world. But what I do in the natural won't help me to perceive the things of the Spirit. So how then do I open up myself to receive? What David is saying is the analogy of gates that speaks of natural perception applies to a spiritual principle. What is the spiritual principle? I don't open up my body to perceive the reality of God. I open up my soul. So what I have to do is lift up the gates of my soul. Lift up the gates of my internal person. And the reason why they are everlasting doors is because the soul will never see death. After this life is over, how you live this life will determine where you go. But if you master it right now, your soul will experience his glory now to make sure that your soul can be in the eternal presence of his glory when this life is over. So what David is saying, lift up the everlasting doors of your soul, the part of you that will keep living, the part of you that will never see death. And the reason why you need to lift up the gates, the reason why you need to lift up the doors is so that the King of Glory can come in. God's glory is available. God's glory is present. God's glory is here. So what you need to do is open up. Open yourself up to the reality of his Spirit so he can come in. Because once he comes in, he is the Lord, strong and mighty. He is the Lord, mighty in battle. Why does David use this description? It is to help us to see that God is undefeated. It is to help us to see that when we let him in, we're letting in the one that conquered death, hell, and the grave.